You think Black grandmas shared all their Thanksgiving secrets freely? Think again. These recipes were guarded like family jewels, passed down only when the time was right, whispered in kitchens where trust was earned through years of loyalty. Here are 30 secret Thanksgiving recipes Black grandmas refused to share until now. Sweet potato casserole with the burnt marshmallow top was never just about following a recipe. It was about knowing exactly when to pull it from the oven, so the marshmallows turned golden with crispy edges while staying gooey underneath. Grandmas baked sweet potatoes until soft, then mashed them with butter, brown sugar, vanilla, and nutmeg. The mixture was spread into buttered dishes, topped with miniature marshmallows in perfect rows. The secret? The casserole went into a 350-degree oven for 20 minutes, then under the broiler for exactly 90 seconds while Grandma watched without blinking. Those 90 seconds separated perfection from disaster. She'd learned this timing through decades of Thanksgivings. The marshmallow layer had to bubble, caramelize, and turn toasty without burning, creating a crust that crackled when you broke through to the sweet potatoes below. This was precision passed down through generations, shared only with granddaughters they trusted. Cornbread dressing carried secrets in every crumb, starting with cornbread baked days before and left to dry out on purpose. Grandma crumbled that stale cornbread into bowls, adding sautéed onions, celery, and bell peppers cooked in butter until sweet. Chicken broth came next, never from a can, but always homemade from boiling the turkey neck and giblets overnight. The secret ratio was 3 parts cornbread to 1 part broth, just enough to stick without turning mushy. Then came beaten eggs, sage she grew herself, and fresh black pepper. She'd mix with bare hands, feeling for perfect consistency that only decades could recognize. The dressing went into cast iron, surface smoothed flat, then baked at 375 degrees until the top formed a golden crust. The secret she guarded most. A handful of crumbled breakfast sausage mixed in, just enough to add richness without anyone identifying what made it incredible. She never wrote this down, never measured, just knew by touch and instinct. Macaroni and cheese that made grown men cry required a cheese blend Grandma refused to reveal for years. She'd start with a roux, butter, and flour cooked while stirring until golden and nutty. Whole milk got added slowly, creating velvety sauce. Then came the magic. Equal parts sharp cheddar for bite, Colby for creaminess, and Velveeta for smooth texture that made everything melt perfectly. She grated real cheeses herself, never using pre-shredded because those contained anti-caking agents that made sauce grainy. Elbow macaroni cooked exactly 8 minutes, drained but never rinsed because starch helped sauce cling. Everything combined, then transferred to a buttered dish. The secret that changed everything? She'd beat 2 eggs with half-cup evaporated milk and pour it over before baking, creating a custard layer that set everything into sliceable perfection. More cheese on top, then into a 350-degree oven for 45 minutes until edges bubbled and corners turned crispy. Turkey brine that guaranteed juicy meat was kept secret because Grandma wanted everyone to think she was naturally gifted. The brine started 3 days before, a 5-gallon bucket filled with cold water, kosher salt, brown sugar, peppercorns, bay leaves, thyme, and the secret ingredient nobody guessed, apple cider that added sweetness and broke down muscle fibers. The turkey soaked in the garage, turning every 12 hours. Thanksgiving morning, she'd pull it out, rinse thoroughly, then pat completely dry because moisture prevented crisping. The real secret came next. She'd separate skin from breast meat by sliding her hand underneath, then pack herb butter directly onto meat under that skin. This melted during roasting, basting from inside while skin protected from drying. She'd never tell anyone about the brine, just smiled when people asked how her turkey stayed moist. The herb butter was another secret. Room temperature butter whipped with sage, rosemary, thyme, and roasted garlic. Collard greens that tasted like soul food magic started with selecting right greens at the market, dark green leaves neither too thick nor thin. Grandma washed them 3 times, swishing greens then lifting them out so grit settled. She'd strip leaves from stems, roll them tight like cigars, and slice into ribbons. The Potlikker base started with smoked turkey wings simmered for hours with onions, garlic, and the secret ingredient, a ham hock saved from Christmas that had hung in her freezer almost a year. This combination of smoked turkey and aged ham created depth that couldn't be replicated. Greens got added in batches, wilting as they hit hot liquid, stirred under with a wooden spoon that had stirred greens for 3 generations. Apple cider vinegar went in next, just enough to brighten without making it pickled, and hot sauce for heat that built slowly. The greens cooked low for 3 hours, never boiling hard, just barely bubbling until tender and dark. Candied yams with sticky glaze that made your fingers shine were built on technique Grandma learned from her grandmother and protected fiercely. She'd select yams that were firm and heavy, never soft or sprouting, and bake them whole at 400 degrees for an hour until a fork slid through like butter. After cooling, she'd peel skins, slice into thick rounds, and layer them in a buttered dish. The glaze was where magic lived. Melted butter, brown sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and the secret ingredient nobody could identify, a tablespoon of bourbon that burned off but left deep sweetness. She'd pour this over yams, making sure every piece got coated, then dot the top with more butter. The dish baked at 350 degrees for 30 minutes, pulled out twice to spoon glaze back over, building layers that got richer each time. Some yams would caramelize at edges, turning almost candy-like. The secret she guarded most fiercely? Adding orange zest to the glaze, just enough for brightness. Green bean casserole that wasn't the basic soup can recipe required fresh green beans Grandma snapped by hand the night before. She'd blanch them in boiling salted water for 3 minutes, then shock in ice water to preserve bright color. The sauce wasn't canned soup but homemade mushroom cream, starting with butter, flour, and heavy cream whisked thick. Fresh mushrooms got sliced thin and sautéed until golden, adding earthy depth. She'd combine beans with sauce, add crispy fried onions she made by soaking sliced onions in buttermilk, then dredging in seasoned flour before frying. The real secret was adding sharp cheddar to the sauce, just enough for richness without turning it into cheese soup, and a splash of sherry that added flavor nobody could place. The casserole baked until bubbling and edges got crispy, topped with more fried onions right before serving so they stayed crunchy. This wasn't convenience food, it was craft and love. Cranberry sauce that made store-bought taste like colored water started with fresh cranberries Grandma bought in bulk. She'd rinse carefully, picking through to remove soft ones, then combine in a pot with sugar, orange juice, and the secret ingredient, a cinnamon stick and 3 cloves that infused warm spice without overwhelming cranberry tartness. The mixture simmered as berries began to pop and burst, releasing pectin that thickened sauce naturally. She'd stir occasionally, but not constantly because she wanted some berries whole for texture. After 15 minutes, when sauce coated the spoon and fell off in thick ribbons, she'd pull from heat and stir in orange zest using a microplane to grate just colored peel without bitter pith. The sauce went into a glass bowl to cool, thickening more as it cooled, reaching perfect consistency. The secret she never told? Adding a tablespoon of port wine at the end, giving depth and complexity that made people take seconds. Pecan pie with filling that stayed perfectly set instead of runny required understanding ratios Grandma had memorized decades ago. She'd make her own crust using lard because lard created flakier layers that shattered when bitten. The crust got blind baked 10 minutes, lined with foil and filled with dried beans. The filling was precise balance of dark corn syrup, eggs, brown sugar, vanilla, and melted butter, whisked smooth. Pecans got toasted in a dry skillet 5 minutes, intensifying buttery flavor before being arranged in the crust. The secret that separated Grandma's pie? She'd add a tablespoon of bourbon and a teaspoon of espresso powder to filling, neither enough to taste directly, but both adding depth that made pie taste more intensely of itself. The pie baked at 350 degrees for 50 minutes, tested by jiggling the pan, looking for center to have slight wobble while edges were firm. Overbaking made filling crack and become grainy. Dinner rolls that stayed soft for days started with dough Grandma mixed the night before and let rise in the refrigerator overnight. She'd combine warm milk, melted butter, sugar, salt, yeast, and eggs, beating everything before adding flour until dough was soft and slightly sticky. The cold rise developed flavor and made dough easier to handle. In morning, she'd pull it out to reach room temperature before shaping. She'd divide dough into pieces, roll each into perfect balls, then arrange in a buttered pan so they touched. The secret to soft texture was brushing tops with melted butter before the second rise, then brushing again after baking. They'd rise until doubled, then bake at 375 degrees for 18 minutes until golden. The moment they came out, she'd brush with more butter mixed with honey, creating glossy glaze. These rolls pulled apart instead of being cut, each one pillowy and buttery, perfect for sopping gravy. Giblet gravy that people fought over started with giblets most families threw away, but Grandma knew held the secret to deep, rich flavor. She'd simmer the turkey neck, heart, and gizzard in water with onions, celery, and bay leaves for hours, creating stock so flavorful it could stand alone as soup. When the turkey came out, she'd pour off drippings from the roasting pan, letting fat rise to the top so she could skim most while keeping precious brown bits stuck to the bottom. She'd make a roux in the same pan with turkey fat and flour, scraping up all those caramelized bits, then slowly whisk in the giblet stock until it turned silky. The giblets got chopped fine and stirred back in, adding texture and depth. The secret ingredient? A splash of dry sherry added right at the end, giving gravy complexity people couldn't quite identify. This gravy was labor-intensive, requiring constant attention and perfect timing, but it turned plain turkey into something transcendent. Deviled eggs with filling so creamy it looked like it came from a pastry bag required technique Grandma perfected over 50 years. She'd hard-boil eggs by placing them in cold water, bringing to a boil, then removing from heat and letting them sit covered for 12 minutes before plunging into ice water. This prevented that green ring around the yolk. She'd peel the eggs under running water, then slice them lengthwise with one smooth cut. The yolks got mashed until no lumps remained, then mixed with mayonnaise, yellow mustard, and white vinegar in proportions she'd memorized. But the secret was adding a tablespoon of pickle juice from her homemade bread and butter pickles, giving the filling subtle sweetness and extra tang. She'd spoon the mixture into a plastic bag, cut off one corner, and pipe it back into the whites, creating perfect swirls. A sprinkle of paprika on top wasn't just decoration, it added smokiness. These eggs disappeared from the table within minutes. Sweet potato pie that rivaled any pumpkin pie started with sweet potatoes roasted in their skins until they collapsed when touched. Grandma would never boil them because boiling made them watery and diluted natural sweetness. After roasting and cooling, she'd scoop out the flesh and mash until completely smooth. The filling was perfect balance of sweet potato, brown sugar, evaporated milk, eggs, butter, vanilla, nutmeg, and cinnamon, mixed until it looked like pale orange silk. But the secret ingredient was a tablespoon of dark rum and a pinch of ground ginger, adding warmth and complexity without being identifiable. She'd pour the filling into an unbaked pie crust and bake at 350 degrees for 55 minutes until the center was just barely set with a slight jiggle. The pie had to cool completely before slicing, and she'd make it the day before so flavors had time to develop. The top developed a beautiful sheen, and each slice cut clean. This wasn't just pie, it was heritage on a plate. Honey-glazed ham that stayed moist and never dried out required a cooking method Grandma guarded jealously because too many people had ruined good ham. She'd start with a fully cooked spiral ham, score the outside in a diamond pattern, then stud each diamond with a whole clove for flavor and visual appeal. The ham went into a roasting pan with a cup of water in the bottom, covered tightly with foil to trap steam and keep moisture in. It baked low at 275 degrees, allowing it to heat through gently. The glaze was where magic happened, equal parts honey and brown sugar melted with butter, Dijon mustard, and the secret ingredient, a quarter cup of bourbon that burned off but left behind caramelized depth. She'd brush this glaze over the ham every 20 minutes during the last hour, building up layers of sticky sweetness that turned almost candy-like. The final glaze went on just before pulling from the oven, giving it a glossy finish. This ham was always the centerpiece of the table. Buttermilk biscuits that split apart in perfect layers required understanding that cold ingredients and hot oven were keys to success. Grandma would cube cold butter and work it into flour, baking powder, salt, and sugar using just her fingertips, moving quickly so her heat wouldn't melt the butter. She'd work until the mixture looked like coarse crumbs with pea-sized butter pieces, because those would create steam pockets that made layers. Cold buttermilk got stirred in just until the dough came together, and she'd turn it out, pat it into a rectangle, then fold it over itself 3 times like a letter. She'd pat it out to 3/4-inch thickness and cut biscuits with a sharp cutter, pressing straight down without twisting. The biscuits got placed close in a cast-iron skillet so they'd rise up instead of out, then brushed with melted butter before going into a 450-degree oven for 12 minutes. They came out golden, towering, and so tender they almost dissolved on your tongue. Apple pie with a lattice crust that looked magazine-worthy started with apples Grandma selected carefully, using a mix of Granny Smith for tartness and Honeycrisp for sweetness. She'd peel, core, and slice them thin, then toss with sugar, flour, cinnamon, nutmeg, and the secret ingredient that kept the filling from getting watery, a tablespoon of instant tapioca that absorbed the apple juice. A squeeze of lemon juice brightened everything. The bottom crust was rolled thin and fitted into the pie plate. Then she'd pile in the apples, mounding them high because they'd cooked down. Dots of butter got scattered over before the lattice went on. She'd roll out the top crust, cut it into even strips with a ruler, then weave them in an over-under pattern that took patience but looked stunning. The edges got crimped with a fork, and she'd brush the whole thing with egg wash mixed with a pinch of sugar. The pie baked at 375 degrees for 50 minutes until the filling bubbled through and the crust turned deep gold. Mashed potatoes that people scraped the bowl to get required technique that seemed simple but was full of small decisions that made enormous differences. Grandma used Yukon Gold potatoes because they were naturally buttery and creamy. She'd peel them and cut into equal-sized chunks so they'd cook evenly, then put them in cold, salted water and bring to a boil. Once tender, she'd drain completely and let them sit in the pot for a minute to let moisture steam off. The secret to smooth potatoes was using a ricer instead of a masher, pushing them through so there were no lumps. Hot milk and melted butter got stirred in along with salt and white pepper, and she'd add a dollop of cream cheese that gave extra richness and subtle tang. But the real secret? A teaspoon of garlic powder mixed in, just enough to add depth without tasting obviously like garlic. She'd transfer them to a serving bowl and make a well in the center that she'd fill with more melted butter that pooled like liquid gold. Brunswick stew that simmered for hours filled the house with smells that made everyone's mouth water before sitting down. Grandma would start by browning a whole chicken cut into pieces, getting good color before adding chicken broth to cover and simmering until the meat fell off the bone. She'd pull out the chicken, let it cool, then shred the meat, discarding bones and skin. Back into the pot went the meat with diced potatoes, lima beans, corn, tomatoes, and the secret ingredient, a splash of apple cider vinegar that brightened flavors without making it vinegary. The stew simmered low for another 2 hours, thickening as potatoes broke down and flavors melded. She'd stir occasionally to prevent sticking, adjusting seasoning with salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar. Some families added barbecue sauce, but Grandma said proper Brunswick stew should taste like the ingredients themselves. The finished stew was thick enough to stand a spoon in, rich and hearty enough to be a meal by itself. This was comfort in a bowl. Oyster dressing that separated the old guard from newcomers was controversial because people either loved oysters or hated them, but Grandma made it anyway because tradition mattered. She'd start with fresh shucked oysters, never canned, and their liquor which added briny depth. Cornbread got crumbled and mixed with sautéed celery, onions, and plenty of butter. Then the oysters and their liquid got stirred in along with chicken broth, beaten eggs, and sage. The oysters would shrink during baking but left behind their essence that flavored every bite. She'd spread the mixture in a buttered baking dish and bake at 350 degrees until the top turned golden and the edges got crispy. The secret that made skeptics believers was adding a handful of chopped bacon that had been fried crispy. This dressing was rich, briny, and deeply savory. Children usually avoided it, but adults who grew up eating it couldn't imagine Thanksgiving without it, reaching for seconds, while others stuck to regular dressing. Ambrosia salad that looked like it belonged at a fancy luncheon, but was simple to make, required Grandma's specific proportions. She'd start with canned mandarin oranges drained completely because excess liquid would make the salad soupy, fresh pineapple chunks, seedless grapes halved, and miniature marshmallows. Sweetened shredded coconut got toasted in a dry pan until golden, adding nutty flavor and crunch. The dressing was the secret, sour cream mixed with just enough powdered sugar to sweeten without making it cloying, and a splash of vanilla that rounded out flavors. She'd fold everything together gently so fruit didn't break down, then refrigerate for 2 hours so flavors could marry and marshmallows would soften slightly. Right before serving, she'd top it with maraschino cherries cut in half and more toasted coconut, making it look like a celebration. This salad was sweet, creamy, and refreshing, providing contrast to all the heavy, savory dishes on the table. Red velvet cake that was actually red, not brownish, required technique Grandma perfected over decades. She'd cream butter and sugar until fluffy, then beat in eggs one at a time. The red color came from a full 2-ounce bottle of red food coloring because that's what created true red instead of rust. Cocoa powder got mixed in, just enough to make it chocolate-kissed rather than full chocolate. Buttermilk alternated with flour as she added them, keeping the batter smooth. The secret ingredient that made the texture impossibly tender was adding a tablespoon of white vinegar right before baking, which reacted with baking soda to create air pockets throughout. She'd divide the batter between 3 round pans and bake at 350 degrees for 25 minutes. The cream cheese frosting was simple but required patience, beating softened cream cheese with butter until fluffy before adding powdered sugar and vanilla. The cake had to be completely cool before frosting, or the layers would slide. This was showstopper dessert that made people gasp. Bread pudding that people called sinful started with day-old French bread torn into chunks and left out overnight to get stale. She'd arrange the bread in a buttered baking dish, then make a custard by whisking together eggs, heavy cream, whole milk, sugar, vanilla, cinnamon, and the secret ingredient, a tablespoon of bourbon and a teaspoon of nutmeg. This custard got poured over the bread and left to soak for 20 minutes. Raisins that had been soaked in rum got scattered throughout, adding pockets of sweetness. The pudding baked at 350 degrees for 45 minutes until the top turned golden and slightly crispy, while the inside stayed custardy. But the real secret was the bourbon sauce made by melting butter with brown sugar and heavy cream, then stirring in more bourbon off heat. This sauce got poured over each serving, soaking into warm pudding and creating layers of flavor that made grown men close their eyes. This wasn't light dessert. It was decadent indulgence everyone craved. Pineapple casserole that confused people who'd never heard of it was a Southern tradition that bridged side dish and dessert. Grandma would drain canned pineapple chunks thoroughly, then mix them with sugar, flour, and sharp cheddar cheese in proportions that seemed wrong until you tasted the finished dish. The combination of sweet pineapple and sharp cheese shouldn't have worked but created something magical. She'd butter a casserole dish, pour in the pineapple mixture, then top it with crushed Ritz crackers mixed with melted butter until it looked like golden sand. The casserole baked at 350 degrees for 30 minutes until the top turned crispy and the cheese melted into the pineapple. Some people added marshmallows, but Grandma thought that was overkill. The secret she never told was adding a pinch of cayenne to the cheese mixture, just barely enough to create warmth without being identifiable. This dish sparked debates every Thanksgiving between people who loved it and people who thought it was strange. But even skeptics usually took seconds. Chess bars that disappeared faster than any other dessert started with a shortbread crust Grandma pressed into a 9x13 pan and baked until just set. The filling was pure Southern decadence, eggs beaten with sugar, melted butter, and vanilla until it looked like pale yellow silk. A handful of shredded coconut and chopped pecans got stirred in, adding texture and richness. But the secret ingredient was a tablespoon of white vinegar, which gave the filling subtle tang that balanced the sweetness and made people unable to stop at one bar. The filling got poured over the warm crust and baked at 350 degrees for 30 minutes until the top turned golden and set firm, but still had slight give. The bars had to cool completely before cutting, and she'd dust them with powdered sugar right before serving. Each bar was dense, sweet, and incredibly rich, with a buttery crust and chewy filling that tasted like pecan pie in bar form. These were gone within an hour, with people sneaking back for thirds and fourths when they thought no one was looking. Lemon meringue pie with meringue that reached the sky required understanding how to work with temperamental egg whites. Grandma would make the crust first, blind baking it until golden and crispy. The filling was fresh lemon juice, sugar, cornstarch, egg yolks, and butter cooked together on the stovetop while stirring constantly until it thickened enough to coat a spoon. She'd pour this into the baked crust while still hot. The meringue was where most people failed, but Grandma had it perfected. She'd beat egg whites with a pinch of cream of tartar until foamy, then gradually add sugar while beating until the whites formed stiff, glossy peaks. The secret was adding a teaspoon of vanilla and spreading the meringue over the hot filling while both were still warm, sealing the edges completely to prevent weeping. The pie went into a 400-degree oven for exactly 10 minutes, just long enough to brown the peaks without cooking the filling further. This pie was dramatic, beautiful, and tasted like sunshine captured in pastry. Corn pudding that was nothing like creamed corn required fresh corn cut from the cob if possible, or frozen corn if fresh wasn't available. Grandma would combine the corn with beaten eggs, heavy cream, sugar, melted butter, and a bit of flour. Salt and white pepper seasoned it, and the secret ingredient was a pinch of nutmeg that added warmth without being identifiable. She'd pour the mixture into a buttered dish and bake at 350 degrees for 45 minutes until golden and just barely set. The pudding was sweet, creamy, and rich, almost like savory custard studded with corn. Some families added jalapenos, but Grandma kept hers classic. This dish was so popular that she always made 2 pans. The corn pudding complemented both turkey and ham perfectly, and its creamy sweetness provided balance to all the savory dishes. This was comfort food that made the table complete. Divinity candy that required perfect weather was something Grandma only made on dry, low-humidity days because moisture would prevent it from setting. She'd combine sugar, corn syrup, and water in a pot, cooking without stirring until it reached 260 degrees. Meanwhile, egg whites would be beaten to stiff peaks. The hot syrup got poured slowly into the beaten whites while mixing constantly, creating a thick, glossy mixture. Vanilla and chopped pecans got folded in, then she'd drop spoonfuls onto wax paper to cool. The candy was pure white, fluffy, and sweet, melting on your tongue while pecans provided crunch. The secret to perfect divinity was adding a tiny pinch of salt to the egg whites before beating, which stabilized them. This candy was labor-intensive and finicky, but when it worked, it was like eating sweet clouds. Sock it to me cake that got its name from a 1960s catchphrase was a sour cream coffee cake Grandma made in a bundt pan. She'd cream butter and sugar, add eggs, then alternate adding flour and sour cream. The batter was divided, and one half got mixed with cinnamon, brown sugar, and pecans to create the filling. She'd pour half the plain batter into a greased bundt pan, spread the cinnamon mixture over it, then top with remaining batter. The cake baked at 350 degrees for 55 minutes. While still warm, she'd poke holes all over it and pour a glaze made from powdered sugar, butter, and vanilla over the top. The secret ingredient was adding rum to both the batter and glaze, giving the cake depth. This cake stayed moist for days and actually tasted better the second day. It was perfect with coffee the morning after Thanksgiving. Molasses cookies that were soft and chewy required chilling the dough before baking or they'd spread too thin. Grandma would cream butter with white and brown sugar, add an egg and molasses, then stir in flour, baking soda, cinnamon, ginger, and cloves. The dough would be sticky, so she'd cover it and refrigerate for 2 hours. Once chilled, she'd roll spoonfuls into balls, then roll each in granulated sugar before placing on sheets. The cookies baked at 350 degrees for 10 minutes, pulled out while slightly underdone because they'd continue cooking. The secret to perfect soft center was underbaking them and adding dark corn syrup along with molasses. These cookies had crispy edges with soft centers that tasted like gingerbread. They were perfect for dunking in coffee, and Grandma always sent leftovers home with guests wrapped in wax paper and love. Macaroni and cheese made from scratch with government cheese became the creamy casserole that turned welfare assistance into something families served with pride. Government commodity cheese, distributed through assistance programs, came in large blocks that creative mothers transformed into dishes that tasted better than store-bought. The cheese had unique texture and sharp flavor that melted beautifully when combined with evaporated milk, eggs, and elbow macaroni bought in bulk. Women layered the mixture in large baking dishes, topping it with extra cheese and sometimes breadcrumbs, then baked until golden and bubbling. The result was dense, creamy mac and cheese that could feed 20 people with just 2 boxes of pasta and 1 block of government cheese. Children loved it because the cheese pulled into strings with each serving. This wasn't bland, watery mac and cheese from boxes, but rich custard-like casserole that required skill to perfect. Black mothers took pride in their mac and cheese recipes. Navy bean and ham bone soup was the meal that turned leftovers into legend, a dish that spoke of slow hours and full hearts. The leftover ham bone from Sunday's meal went into a big pot with dry beans, onions, and water, and from that, magic was born. It simmered for hours until the beans softened and the meat slipped from the bone. The broth turned smoky, thick, and fragrant, filling the air with a scent that could stop conversation mid-sentence. Each spoonful carried history of thrift, care, and kitchens that knew patience by name. Sometimes carrots or celery were added if the garden gave enough. Other times, it was just beans and hope. The soup was ladled into mismatched bowls, steaming and hearty, the kind of meal that made even a cold house feel warm. Every bite tasted like effort made worthwhile, like gratitude turned into nourishment. It was proof that love, when simmered slowly, could feed a family for days. Macaroni salad with egg and relish was the dish that showed up at every gathering. Cold, creamy, and a little tangy, it was made to be shared. The macaroni was boiled until soft, then mixed with chopped boiled eggs, sweet relish, and a spoonful of mayonnaise. A sprinkle of paprika on top gave it that perfect touch of pride. It was refreshing after a plate full of fried food and rich sides. Every family had their own version. Some added onions, others celery, but the feeling was always the same. Grandparents made it ahead of time so it could chill and let the flavors come together. It was comfort in a bowl, cool and familiar as an old song. The first taste was always soft and creamy, followed by that gentle pop of relish sweetness. It brought a balance to heavy meals and a pause between bites of heat and spice. Grandparents would stir it with quiet focus, knowing everyone expected it on the table. It wasn't just about the food, it was about showing care in the details, the small touches that turned gatherings into memories. Even now, that first spoonful can take you straight back to church basements, family reunions, and long summer evenings. Breaded veal patties were once a diner favorite that found steady homes in 1960s kitchens, served with gravy and mashed potatoes like something straight off a lunch counter menu. Families bought them because they were inexpensive, easy to cook, and tasted tender once fried and covered in gravy. The breading gave them a crisp exterior, while the inside stayed soft and mild, making them a hit with children who had not yet learned to love stronger flavors. The dish felt comforting, reliable, and just hearty enough to end a long day right. Even though they appear less often today, many people still crave that nostalgic taste because it reminds them of childhood dinners served hot on plates that clattered slightly when set on the table. There was something reassuring about the whole routine, from hearing the sizzle of the patties in the pan to watching the gravy bubble as it thickened. It was a kind of dinner that did not require fuss or stress, only a warm pan, a steady hand, and the quiet instinct of someone who cooked from memory instead of recipes. Those veal patties were proof that simple food could feel like a feast when shared at a table filled with familiar voices and everyday conversation. Triple chocolate chess pie combined Southern tradition with chocolate decadence, creating a dessert so rich that small slices satisfied. Black mothers started with homemade pie crust made with lard, blind baked until golden. The filling was classic chess pie: eggs, sugar, butter, vinegar, and cornmeal, but transformed with 3 chocolates: cocoa powder whisked into sugar, melted bittersweet chocolate folded into eggs, and chocolate chips scattered across the crust. The secret was using buttermilk instead of regular milk, which reacted with chocolate to create brownie-like fudginess while maintaining chess pie's crisp top. Vanilla and espresso powder deepened the chocolate. The pie baked until the center barely wobbled, then cooled where it set into something between custard and fudge. The top crackled when pressed, giving way to dense chocolate richness. This appeared only at Christmas because chocolate was expensive. Mothers kept the triple chocolate technique and buttermilk secret. Pan-fried gizzards were the kind of meal that proved patience was as important as any spice. Tough and chewy at first, these scraps of poultry were transformed through slow cleaning, seasoning, and frying into golden bites of pride. A bowl of seasoned flour, a splash of buttermilk, and a hot cast-iron skillet were all it took to turn what most people ignored into something worth gathering for. The gizzards hissed in oil until they were crisp on the outside and tender within, each one carrying the smoky taste of hard work and heart. Families would pile them high on paper towels, watching the steam rise like a promise that dinner was ready. Every batch felt earned, every crunch a reminder that flavor came from care, not wealth. Children gnawed at the edges, soaking the last bits in hot sauce, while elders nodded in approval. Pan-fried gizzards were food that spoke of resourcefulness, a celebration of making something special from nothing. They filled kitchens with the sound of sizzling survival, the scent of seasoning that lingered long after the plates were empty. In every bite was proof that thrift could taste like triumph. Collard greens cooked with smoked turkey tails instead of ham hocks provided the traditional side dish at a fraction of the cost, turning a bag of greens into nourishment that carried flavor and cultural meaning. Turkey tails, often overlooked and heavily discounted at butcher counters, contained enough fat and smokiness to season an entire pot for under $2. Black mothers would buy 3 or 4 pounds of fresh collards from produce stands where vegetables stayed affordable. The greens were washed repeatedly until no grit remained, then chopped and added to pots where turkey tails had been simmering with onions and vinegar. Hours of slow cooking broke down the greens until they turned silky, while potlikker became broth so flavorful that people sipped it from cups. This wasn't just a side dish, but vitamin-rich vegetables that provided essential nutrients. Families served collards alongside everything else, understanding that greens represented prosperity. Stewed okra and corn was summer's promise kept alive in a bowl. Bright yellow kernels and tender green okra met in a bubbling pan with a touch of butter and black pepper. It didn't look fancy, but one bite told you everything about family gardens, hot days, and cool kitchens. Grandparents knew how to make this taste like something special without spending a dime. It was one of those dishes that balanced sweetness and earthiness perfectly, the corn melting into the okra softening just enough to hold it together. It went with everything, from fried fish to biscuits, but it could also stand alone when the pantry ran thin. Kids who grew up on it remember the crackle of the pan and the smell that meant dinner was near. It's a dish that lives in the quiet corners of memory, humble and honest. Meatloaf with ketchup glaze was the kind of weeknight classic that held families together without anyone realizing it at the time. Grandparents and parents would mix ground meat with breadcrumbs, onions, and whatever seasoning lived in the spice cabinet, shaping it into a loaf that somehow always came out the same, no matter who made it. Then came the glaze, that sweet layer of ketchup spread across the top in thick strokes that caramelized in the oven until it turned sticky, glossy, and just a little smoky around the edges. The smell filled the whole house long before dinner was served, drifting down hallways and under bedroom doors like a promise you could count on. cutting into the loaf felt almost ceremonial, each slice holding that perfect balance of soft inside and crisp outside. Kids would poke at it, drizzle more ketchup over it, and still come back for seconds without hesitation. It was affordable, dependable, and tasted like routine in the best way. Even today, people crave it because it reminds them of a dinner table where nothing was fancy but everything felt secure. That ketchup glaze was never gourmet, but it was warm, familiar, and a taste memory glued firmly to childhood. Cowpea soup simmered like a prayer whispered over a fire. The pot would start with water, a scoop of dried field peas, and maybe a scrap of salted meat if the week had been kind. Onions and garlic joined in, releasing their scent as the broth thickened into something golden and strong. The cowpeas, small and sturdy, softened slowly, their flavor deepening with every hour. This wasn't fast food, it was patient food, built on rhythm and time. Families made it during harvest, when work was hard and hands needed warmth. It was ladled into tin bowls and passed around without ceremony, each bite grounding you in gratitude. Sometimes cornbread floated on top like an offering, soaking up the last drops of broth. The soup tasted of earth and labor, of simple things done well. Cowpea soup was both meal and memory, tying together generations who had learned how to make plenty out of little. It was food for body and spirit alike, humble but whole, strong but Great-grandmother's coconut cake was a 3-layer monument to coconut in every form. Black mothers baked white cake layers flavored with coconut milk, giving them moisture that lasted through New Year's. The frosting was genuine boiled icing, sugar, corn syrup, and egg whites beaten while hot syrup drizzled in, creating something between frosting and marshmallow. The secret was the coconut preparation. Fresh coconut was grated, then toasted until golden and fragrant, mixed with sweetened flaked coconut for texture. Between each layer went coconut cream filling, thick and custardy. The assembled cake was covered in boiled frosting, then pressed with handfuls of toasted coconut until no white showed. It was refrigerated overnight so flavors could meld, resulting in cake so moist it melted on your tongue. This recipe stayed secret because it required genuine skill and patience. Store-bought frosting wouldn't work, and rushing the boiled icing meant failure. Sweet pea and potato casserole was one of those gentle, unassuming dishes that fed families through tight budgets and busy lives. It came together from pantry staples: canned peas, diced potatoes, a bit of cream or broth, and whatever seasoning happened to be nearby. Once baked, it softened into a creamy, comforting dish that tasted like warmth itself. It was not bold, not spicy, not dramatic, but it did not need to be. It was the kind of food that sat quietly on the table, filling plates and stomachs without fanfare. Kids often pushed peas around their plates only to realize, bite by bite, that the casserole actually tasted pretty good. Adults appreciated that it stretched ingredients far enough to feed everyone while still feeling whole. It tasted like a memory of soft kitchen light and evenings that moved slowly. Even now, there is something deeply soothing about the simplicity of peas and potatoes baked together, reminding people that comfort does not need to be complicated. Neck bone gravy over rice became the foundation when turkey was beyond reach, transforming the cheapest cuts into liquid gold that satisfied entire families. Black mothers would simmer pork or beef neck bones for hours with onions, garlic, and bay leaves until the meat felt tender and the broth turned rich. The bones cost pennies per pound at butcher shops, yet held marrow that created gravy with body and soul. Women knew that patience turned scarcity into abundance, letting those bones bubble on back burners from morning until afternoon. The finished gravy was thick, savory, and packed with protein from the shredded meat. Poured generously over white rice, this combination stretched to feed 20 people when turkey could barely serve 8. Children sopped up every drop with cornbread, while adults appreciated how resourcefulness created satisfaction without shame. Neckbone gravy wasn't poverty food, but proof that love and skill mattered more than money. Corncob jelly was one of those miracles that made people smile at their own cleverness. When the corn was shucked and the cobs left behind, no one dared to throw them out. Those bear cobs went into a big pot of water, boiled until the water turned golden and sweet-smelling. Sugar and a little lemon juice got added next, then everything was strained until the liquid gleamed like honey. The result was a jelly that tasted faintly of corn, syrupy and light, the perfect spread for biscuits or toast. People used it when fruit was scarce, and it carried a quiet pride that came from turning scraps into sweetness. Grandparents remembered it from their childhood, when waste was not an option and imagination ruled the kitchen. Corncob jelly was proof that flavor could be coaxed out of what others might ignore. It was soft, shining, and made with patience. Those who tasted it never forgot that feeling of abundance born from scarcity. Each spoonful told the story of hands that worked hard, saved everything, and still found time to make something beautiful. Which of these secret recipes would you try first? Drop it in the comments, hit like if these brought back memories, and subscribe for more forgotten family favorites that deserve to be remembered and shared.